Today we talk about politics of change with three ladies working as entrepreneurs, founders and board members. Politics of change, what does it really mean? What does it include and what does it not include? I've actually started out with finding 3 quotes from role models that these ladies have given to me, which I will explore a little bit later. First I will introduce them. We have Moulsari Jain. She is social innovation artist, speaker and creative coach and consultant. We have Niki van Wijk, board member, investor and founder of Due North. Due North is an organisation that helps organisations to discover their true north, navigating complexity and growth. And we have Awura Abena, founder of Creative Women Collective and Creative Women Agency. My name is Anne-Marie Twig and welcome. As said, I would start out this conversation with a few quotes from role models that these ladies have shared with me previously. One is by Ricardo Semler. He's a CEO, Brazilian CEO, and author of the book, The Success Story Behind the World's Most Unusual Workplace. And he says, Fernando was gone, but his tough guy philosophy was alive if endangered. You've taken away my powers. Supervisors would complain when they bumped into me in the halls. I can't even tell my people are arriving on time. Or, how do you expect me to meet this month's sales goals when I don't have control anymore? They would tell me they were confused. They wanted me to explain Semco's policy. I kept thinking that was what was wrong. There was too much policy at Semco and not enough thought, judgment and common sense. But I understood why our managers were scared. I actually have a quote by you, Moulsari, considering you're a speaker and you quoted this at a conference earlier this week. The current systems are built largely by male leaders who historically, across the world, coming from a position of having responsibility to create security and stability in terms of capital and resources. Therefore, the push for efficiency, we need a shift. Now they've done a good job, and it's a good enough job, and it's time to nurture the seeds and grow them into fruit-bearing trees for the future. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about what the context was to that quote. And considering we are at the moment in politics of change in the US, we're right ahead of the election there. Your role model was Oprah Winfrey. She actually made mention with regard to politics and Trump and what is happening in America. And I thought this was also very astounding for the Netherlands. Her quote is, vote your values, vote your conscience. The vitriol and the ads, they are designed to confuse and confound you with fear. When you know the right thing, you can feel it. You can't be influenced by propaganda and fear. Oprah Winfrey. So again, welcome ladies. Thank you again for coming here at Working Wonders.
Thank you.
Let's discuss politics of change. What does it mean for you?
Yeah, when the topic politics of change was brought up in the context of this conversation, I immediately thought about the desire to change the systems within an organization or within the political systems. And through wanting to create that change, struggling with resistance and the concept of power and what it means. Yeah, that was the first thoughts.
That was like your reflex, like, oh, okay,
yeah.
This is what I'm triggering on when I'm thinking about politics of change.
Yeah.
What is that? What did it do for you, Niki? I mean, we came down to somebody who's very big on corporate democracy, but what was your trigger?
Well, the trigger is that, interestingly enough, it didn't bring the trigger to politics in itself. Maybe because I mainly have operated in a commercial and corporate environment. What it brought to me is that there is a lot of politics around change, because there's a lot of for my language, bullshit about change. So people tell and say they want and desire change, but it's because they know and understand that they can't say differently. So to me, there is a lot of politics around change. There's a lot of window dressing in making people responsible for diversity? How can you make an other person other than yourself as a manager responsible for such a big topic? The same for sustainability. So again, not wanting to offend people who have that role. So I support the people who do it. I do not support the system that thinks that that's a hobby that you can literally give to someone else. So for me, the politics about it is the connotation of saying and not doing.
Interesting. Well, I mean, the other time in another episode, I did actually quote Richard Branson, who was saying like diversity and inclusion that should be something across the company and not a little team that's downstairs in the basement.
Completely true.
And then that everybody has to carry it through, and then it shouldn't be, because you mentioned also in our earlier conversation that you dislike companies who have diversity and inclusion at the end of their meetings.
Well, it's funny because if you have, I've sat in our management teams throughout the last 15 years, in a lot of cases as one of the only or single woman. And it's interesting that topics to me that are so relevant and should be core to the business, it's about, we'll talk business now and we'll talk about numbers. So business is only about numbers, mostly, or gossiping about people, because that's what managers do all the time, to be very frank. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll have like, how did the employee experience, results? How did they come in? And also, when they have a result, they will say somebody is taking care of it. And I find that mind-blowingly interesting that you think that is not your responsibility as a management team. So we've created a system where we can just leave those really important topics with other people, whilst the others, men, will run the business. Right. Wow.
Yeah, it's super duper interesting. And again, I mean, I would really like to delve a little bit deeper into why that is, because what is the context for those who are in power, in positions of power, that they don't want to address or like let the other, they've delegated a certain form of responsibility. But before we do that, Moulsari, so what was your trigger with regard to politics of change?
Well, I believe that change is constant and infinite, so much so that that's my only tattoo, infinite change. And for me, that's a reminder to myself that change is constant, so we have the option, the choice to embrace it. And within embracing it, we can actually create change, drive change ourselves, right? Unless we sort of flow with it, play with it, we can't move with it. And ultimately we have to. And perhaps in a very large generalization, we're coming from a very long human history where change essentially happened to people in the world. There were very few people in the world who actually had the power, the position to drive change. Whereas now we see a very big shift, and obviously technology and the internet and travel and all of these things becoming truly kind of democratic is a big part of that. Everyone has a voice that they can speak with. They don't have to wait for the newspaper to arrive and wonder what's going to be said for them on their behalf. And so I think the politics of change have always been there. Before, maybe they were more about a few people holding the keys. Now everyone has a key, and people are being forced to reconfigure how they interact with their world, with each other. And that means a very big shift in the way we organize ourselves, whether that's as a society, as a country, as an organization. Even, I think, within our personal relationships, there's a very big shift because our self-awareness has grown, our awareness of the world has grown, and I think it's becoming less possible to ignore our impact on the world around us and vice versa.
And is that also because of the whole digital? I mean, obviously digital in some ways can be dangerous, but then also in some ways can be liberating, can enhance the democracy. It's interesting, I would like to bridge that over to you, because you have built a collective, but initially it was an offline collective, and now you've gone digital. How did that impact, how did that create change in the build-up and the cohesion of your collective?
The shift from offline to online.
Yeah.
Well, the DNA is the same. We have the same team with the same values who's doing the work. But the online component gives more opportunities because you can scale much bigger. And in offline, you are limited to the space and the time and the energy which you can implement. So actually, starting offline and moving towards online really gave us the time to develop the skills which are needed now to scale up and to reach more people, to create more impact with what we have been doing offline.
So scaling up the voice. So
yes,
so
accelerating.
So coming back to what you're saying is kind of like it has a liberating factor. It can actually even out a way of how we go against, or how power may be shifting with regard to those who have been in positions where they had a lot of power. And I think it would be interesting to hear from you, considering that you've really gone through that whole shift. I mean, you've been around for a very, very long time. You started out at KLM.
20 years ago.
20
People
years
were
ago.
laughing in my face about digital because the internet would pass by.
Oh,
I was
really?
responsible for KLM.nl. We were selling our first online tickets, so in terms of digital, I'm a sort of a dinosaur by now.
Pioneer.
Pioneer.
A more positive connotation, yeah. Yeah.
So how do you look in that, and kind of in actually democratizing? For you, I think at that moment it was an improvement of service. But what else? What else has it?
It was not only an improvement of service. It was also giving at that time, not from an ideological point of view. It was more an opportunity-driven point of view, but giving consumers the choice to decide when they would book a ticket and how. And earlier on, you would, as a consumer, would have to go to a desk, and then that would be open at a certain time, and you would have to rely, even when it came to pricing. There was a tremendous transparency perspective on the whole digitalization of travel and for any product. The only thing is that for everything good, there is a bad side to it, and it's always the same coin. It just has two colors to it. So with all that transparency came also a very negative cycle of pricing. And if you look at the airline industry today, the prices are so cheap, it's irresponsible from a planet perspective. And it has brought much, it has enhanced people to travel, which has a positive side to it. So it's always so ambivalent. But when I look back, what I find interesting of what you said before, I think people have always had individual choices, but these choices, the circumstances under which we can make those choices are changing. And if you take that from a female perspective, women had choices. And 200 years, I have a great grandmother who divorced at the time, which was unimaginable. And she traveled through Europe, and I guess she had the financial means to do so, because otherwise you wouldn't have ever been able to. So there are so many more choices. But when it comes to fundamental shift, I do, and I'd like to quote her, a young writer, Roxane van Iperen, who says and writes a lot about the fact that we can't make those big changes individual responsibilities, because that's where a bit of the mess up comes. And I think it happens the same in organizations. The true responsibilities for the big change should lie in the top, not because I believe in hierarchy, but because I believe in responsibility. And if you delegate again that responsibility to individuals, or then that's unfair, because to the bigger topics in this world, we need the change to happen, and it needs to come from politics, and it needs to come from the big corporates. And I see them diving away from those responsibilities, and they're looking at their shareholders, and they're blaming them. So it's always interesting. You come in companies, and they will tell you, we can't do that because the shareholder or the financial, it's always the financial. I don't know why CFOs, I love CFOs, fine, they calculate really well, it's very important. But they will tell you, you can't do this because of the CFO. I'm like,
Right.
Why?
Right.
Yeah, but this is how the system works. Why? And I think it's tragic to see that the higher you get, the less people feel that they have choices.
Well, one of the things that you triggered me there, because one of the things that I find really interesting, if we take also the digital into account, and you just said, like, when we started out with KLM.nl, we set out to create transparency and freedom of choice for the consumer. Why isn't the digital accepted so much in the area of diversity and inclusion in making elements of companies transparent and kind of building up data? I mean, also again for the CFO, if that is something that is important or evaluation. I just find it super interesting that a lot of those processes are moving into the digital, but there's still a few that
But these numbers don't matter, and you should be really aware about it, because even companies that say they matter, they don't matter because they're not integrated into the heart of the business. So companies
so
work.
it's a value, but it's not their value.
No, it's not, and it's not a business value.
Right.
So even if you embrace the UN goals, what does that mean? I'd love to have. I challenge companies have a conversation about what it truly means, because it does mean that if you embrace a goal, you're going to integrate it into your decision making, truly. And then it's not like, okay, I'm going to do this, but then I have this really big important value, and that's like shareholder value or EBITDA or whatever kind of margin. And then, yes, and then the argument is, yeah, but we need to make money.
Right.
And then we come to your point, is that is a thought concept. And then you can say that's easy speaking, you make good money and you have your home. Money is for a lot of people an essential way to liberate themselves. And I understand that concept, but I am very with you that we don't always need it anymore. You don't need to make a profit of 30% and give that back to shareholders. Why is that a good idea?
Can we bridge that? And I think it would be interesting for you to respond to that, because you're very much in line with what Moulsari is saying here. Why is it that we can't, what is the mechanism then at play that we can't move beyond those those attributes in which we agree that something is valuable or not?
Well, culture is something that we create. It's a collective social contract, right? And when we are all sort of buying into a particular culture, then we know what to expect from each other, how to engage with each other, what the unspoken rules are. However, when culture is relying almost entirely on tradition and history and past, then the renegotiation that's required at a certain moment when things are really shifting is much larger, and it's much scarier for people. And the phrase that came up for me while I was listening to you, as much as I agree with you, I guess my side that's sort of biased towards humanity is ignorance. Ignorance breeds fear.
Agreed.
So at every point, people push back because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to answer those questions, and they have not yet, and again, this is me being very generous, but they have not yet been given permission to not know the answers. So if they're in a leadership position, then they are trained, groomed, convinced that they need to have the answers, otherwise they're going to lose that position. And absolutely, it takes an incredible amount of strength to say, I don't know the answer.
Or vulnerability. There we go.
And also the idea of servant leadership, where you actually, so delegating is one thing, but I think that what we need more of is actually holding space for conversations. Saying to people, look, I don't know, but you don't know either, let's find out together. But that creates such a big space for uncertainty, and that comes back to that idea of discomfort and not being able to sit in it, right? So the important thing that we need now is to be able to experience that discomfort together and create a little bit of space.
But I agree. Uncertainty. But there's also then how do you go about that? Because I feel
I teach people how to do nothing.
We are going to go back to that, but how to do that? Because a lot of people have unconscious conditioning, and I think it's really interesting about your experiences and kind of narrative and when looking back at your background, where you went into a narrative that was conditioned, that was given to you with all the best, the best interests and intentions, etc. So you went into legal school, you became a lawyer, but there was something intrinsically calling out like, okay, this is not, this whole, putting everything back to the letter systemically is not my thing. And that made you shift to building up the Creative Women Collective. So how was that accepted around you? How was your family? How's that conditioning? Were they accepting? Did they not say like, oh my God, she's gone mental? Well, how was that?
Yeah, I think when you shift from a very traditional path towards a more creative, innovative, quote unquote, uncertain path, a lot of questions are raised within your circle. And I think this is a consequence of when you break down the systems, when you question the traditions, your people feel like you're questioning their way of life, their lifestyle. Yes. And with awareness of what is going around you and of those systems, then there's really like in your underbelly you feel like change needs to happen. And I think a lot of people do recognize this within their lives, but to follow that is the most scary thing of all, because you're stepping into uncertainty, which you were explaining.
And often alone.
And you are alone, and there's a lot of discomfort. You need to go dig really deep into vulnerability, and that's a very something people do not like to experience.
Well, and I think, coming back to the corporate system and the bigger companies again, a lot of those who are up there have been very much conditioned through Ivy League schools, through particular learnings and theories. And so, it's one to kind of challenge your family, and, that's also, again, a separate sort of life area. But then there's another thing, and I feel that that's something that's also happening. I don't know, and I'd really like to hear from you guys as well, how you see that. There was a necessity always to be in the office, to actually have that position and to play out that position, right? It was I love the way that Featherstone writes about the controlled decontrolling of emotions. So a lot of people have been educated to be in a particular way so that they can become a leader, so that they can get up to that high level. And now also that theatre has been taken away. Yeah.
The question is, can you, so it has been taken away by COVID to a certain extent, and we should not underestimate but also not overestimate the effects, because when things move back to normal, I wonder to which extent some parts of this change will remain. So a lot has been happening. People couldn't work at home, and now they suddenly can. In a way, you could say, well, that's great, because there were quite a lot of young men and women who wanted it, but what they didn't want is to have their children as well at home and to do homeschooling, and then suddenly. It was a positive thing, but there's also been quite some suffering for people, or you suddenly have to sit with your 5 roommates because you can't afford in Amsterdam to live by yourself and you don't have a place to work.
Or you're by yourself and you're by yourself.
And you're, and
all the time.
All the time, and you're super lonely, but loneliness is a big thing.
Yeah.
I'm triggered by the systems that people were brought up in. I understand that, and I understand very much that people tell that leaders should be people that know. That's what, if you look at a description of, they're hiring someone on a board level, they will tell you that they want a person who is result-oriented, who will do those things, because that's what we still believe very fundamentally that a leader needs to do. So to question it or to be in doubt is considered as weaknesses. So it's about reframing what we consider to be good and not good. And that's where I think diversity can play a role, because it just happens that some of the female qualities, and it's not all, because I've been quite masculine in certain ways, otherwise I wouldn't have survived there. And I've cried a lot, but it's you're being very much frowned upon if you do so. So I've tried to remain as female as possible. So we need to reframe it, and that's where I think a part of the challenge comes. And so yes, there's ignorance, but that there's also responsibility.
Well, and if I can jump in here, you earlier said, fighting or pushing back against your parents is one thing. I'd like to propose the idea, and this is just something came up for me just now. Maybe it's exactly the same thing. Maybe we're moving from a position where parents are supposed to know, and they know best, and you have to follow them no matter what, and even if you don't agree with them, you have to sort of bow in respect. I was raised that way, as much as I was raised in a way to think for myself, which, by the way, is extremely confusing. But, but ultimately, I think, you know, the way, for example, my brother is now parenting his 1-year-old is completely different. The generation parents differently, and in a way, what we expect from our leaders, from our CEOs or managers or even politicians, it's shifting. We don't want parents, but there are also lots of people who still do want a parent.
Your comment triggers me on Bojo, Boris Johnson saying, "Stay in house, you know, go home, stay in the house, go home, stay in the house." Like, you know, telling your child to kind of like be yourself, but listen to me.
Well, and when you've grown up with a certain kind of parenting, having a leader who resembles that is really comfortable. It's actually really familiar, and even if it was dysfunctional, it's what we crave so deeply, and that craving is really hard to let go of.
Interesting, familiarity.
He said in his book, "Why You Marry the Wrong Person," and it's not wrong, but it's about that you remain in the patterns that, even if they might be destructive, are familiar to you. And it's hard. I have 2 teenage children, and it's hard. You know, you want to embrace the good stuff from the past, but you also want to sort of set it in a new way. And I have found that have found parenting one of the biggest struggles in my life, to be very frank.
Wow.
Harder than working, because you feel even more responsible. And indeed, I have really experienced it as a trial and error and finding sort of your way, but also dealing with the insecurity and doing stuff. I mean, I was a working mom, so you get rejected very much for that in the Netherlands for doing so. So you're not invited at the coffee parties at the school, etc., which is fine. But again, also that has brought a lot of very different ambivalent feelings for me about loneliness, and you know, if you want to do it differently. People are not
cheering you on.
No, not really.
Well, because your journey challenges theirs, right?
Exactly. You're questioning their lifestyle.
And because we're designed by nature to build on past learnings and past strengths. So even if it's a dysfunctional learning or a traumatic experience, we still build on that, and to go back and correct that or shift that is a lot of work. It's really hard, and it's not easy to do. And at the same time, I mean, for me, the transition has been, so I was trained as a designer, and as a designer, I think now I realize in my own psychological journey that I think there was some kind of calm that it brought me to put things in order, to create some order in chaos, right? But ultimately, I got to a point personally where I stopped enjoying it. And I realized that I was someone who needed answers and certainty. And I'd gotten to a point in my journey where I actually needed to ask the right questions. And that's why I kind of shifted to calling myself an artist. Because to me, a designer provides answers and an artist asks questions. And they don't need to be answered. They need to be pondered. And again, that uncertainty, that space for what we don't yet know.
But I think it's interesting because you put yourself like into a position of artist, and you indeed say, you know, I'm here to help you find those questions or help you create those questions. You do that as a collective. Is it something that resonates with you when you think about kind of, is that why you're a collective and that you're asking questions and building the answers together as a group?
Yeah, I think I definitely recognize what you're saying. I think as a collective, and especially within my agency, what we try to do is to change the perception of what is normal. So we are all raised with certain images within the media, and through our work, I have photographers, videographers, project managers. They're creating they're creating a new image, a new norm, and basically questioning what is normal when it comes to certain positions, certain jobs, or who is or is not on the cover of a magazine,
the
for
status
example.
quo.
Yeah, the status quo.
Yeah. So we do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, but the
Same
difference is
purpose,
indeed like do you go about it? Because what I think what I like about the way that you're kind of like that Trojan horse, you know, as a single person. No, but you're adaptable in that way. You can really go into, you know, areas and then kind of have different sort of types of conversation. I think. I think your practice is more conversational, where I think yours is more about actually building the theatre and building the narrative and building the image, and that there's conversation inside of that, but that it has more aspects and more
exactly
with reframing.
Yeah, it's more focused on influencing the subconscious. So what are people seeing around them? And from there, it triggers something within them and it changes the way, and it asks them to ask questions about what is normal. So then the journey starts from within instead of maybe conversational.
So what is interesting, because I just wanted to cross over to you. These two are makers of conversation, and they can be quite complex. And where your stance is on navigating through complexity.
Yeah, and the idea is that that you can reduce complexity to a certain extent. Well, it's actually when you come to the theory behind it, it's more complex. But our understanding. So for me, also a new exciting journey. I've spent most of my working life in corporates, in a way fighting the system from within. And when a friend told me, she said, why do you always want to be hired? And then they hire you for being different, and you come in and then you start being really annoying, and they go like, oh, can you quit being really annoying? And so you've done that for 25 years, maybe it's time for change. So when an old colleague of mine called and said, do you want to work with me on change? I'm like, oh, and then I'm going to be a consultant, and you know, will I be taken seriously? So I'm all through the, again, uncertainty of the new being. What I loved about the concept is actually it's quite similar to what you're saying. So the idea of change is that you need to work on the mindset first, and then you need to understand what skills are needed to reach your goal, and then you talk about structure, systems, technology, and data. And the world where I came from, especially working in data and digital, we've always started a lot on the other side. So if we've introduced new technology, we've introduced data, and then it doesn't fly. So that's why it maintains isolated for a long time. And the same happens with redesigning organizations. I don't know why, but within an hour, people are building new structures, and that's not where it begins. So our aim is in a way similar to yours, is by running change programs in organizations which have a business focus, but to work with the teams in the organization is exactly what you were saying, is we would love leaders that say, okay, I don't know how, but we want to move this from A to B. Can you guide us and the team to design the new, and then in that process work on the unconscious concepts that we all have, and that is talking about fear, because when you change, people always want to motivate. So look at Rutte. There's a lot about motivation. If we do this, you will get this. If you do this, this will happen, and you give perspectives. And what happens is at that same moment, people have a physiological reaction to it. Their fear starts entering the situation, if you want it or not. And by being able and aware about it, you can deal with it. And that's...
But even that, I mean, let's really be honest here, even that is something of a mindset, you know, kind of, that when it hurts and when it gets really, really uncomfortable, and when you have, you know, that can really lead to breakdown. Absolutely. You know, this is where people have burnouts and, you know, and stress and all these...
Unless we have conversations. I've been always quite open and frank about how I was feeling. And again, not always very welcome. But I think I have avoided, and I've been on the verge of burnouts a couple of times, but I've avoided them by, and we were discussing it before we started with the cameras on, by trying to look and create the introspective of what's going on in myself. Yeah. And I really would love for this world to be able to look at that more, because if we can be honest about those fears, then we have a starting point for change.
But you know what I also found? That, you know, you have that with your... But there's also a lot of discomfort, and I feel that that's something that was highly interesting from what you said as well, was can you maintain somebody else's discomfort? Because that is also something in play, you know, and I feel that is something that is under discussed, because there's a lot of, I mean, helping oneself, understanding oneself, mirroring oneself. I mean, you know, it almost borders the dangers of, you know, the whole selfie culture, especially with millennials. They're very, you know, for them, that self-focus. That self-focus is actually becoming another type of a problem. And that what I've noticed is that they have a lot of difficulty bearing with somebody else's discomfort, troubles. You know, I've had friends who indeed went into burnout, and drug problems, alcohol problems, like high educated people, very, very, very clever people. And they've told me that the moment that they accepted it from themselves was already a journey. But then when they were with others, they lost friends. Yeah. And they lost allies.
Yeah, that's maybe the advantage of becoming a bit older, is that, you know, there's so much, there is in everybody's lives there's a lot of pain, and that's what I find weird, even with politicians. And I think we underestimate, you know, that having to bury is. I mean, I'm particularly not for VVD on that side of the political arena, but I still, it's sort of, you know, when he said, you know, he buried his mom somewhere in the first few months, I'm like, Jesus, you know, that's been very hurtful for him, and he's supposed to not show this. I don't know. I don't get that.
Right. Yeah.
What is his leadership doubted if he would say, you know, guys, on a personal note, I know what I've handled pain. So the handling of pain is exactly what you're saying, is a very unaccepted part of society, and it's there all the time. And we create pain even without, you know, my first role as a manager, I had made a remark over lunch, and I am so grateful for this guy who walked into my room and he said, can I discuss something? And I saw he was very stressed, and I said, of course. And he said, your remark really hurt me over lunch. I had made a joke. And I'm like, okay. And you know, even in the conversation of inclusion, I didn't know I had hurt him. And he showed me his pain, and he said it made me feel really insecure. And I'm like, you know, I was talking about something and I was really bad at it. So I said that I really suck at it as well. And he said, but you're the manager. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, thank you so much for sharing your pain. And I will always remember, and I still hurt people because we all do. Yeah. And we do it unconsciously. Right. Can we have an open conversation about, coming back to what you're saying, and that's what you want to create in society, in organizations, is to say, can I feel the room to come back to that, you know, and show pain, and then for others to stay with it?
Yeah. Well, I have so many things to say to that, but because you mentioned Alain de Botton, so I also teach for the School of Life here in Amsterdam. And it happened just literally yesterday, where one of the reasons I love working with this organization here in Amsterdam is, you know, we teach emotional intelligence, but everyone in the organization actually walks the talk. So we have difficult conversations. And yesterday, one such conversation happened where my colleague said, you came across really unfriendly to the client. And I actually opened up and I said, you know, we were going to do a 10-minute tech check. It took 90 minutes. I was so stressed out. The whole of my day was slipping away in front of my eyes. And I was so consumed with my own stress that I went into some kind of defensive thing where, you know, and so she brought it to me. We talked about it. I cried to my colleague over the phone and told her all these things that I normally don't tell anyone. And now I'm here telling all of you in front of a camera. But the truth is, it was a healing experience, simply because I could actually talk to my colleague, human to human, and say, look, I hear you. I'm really sorry that it came across that way. I want to be honest and vulnerable. I didn't realize. And here's why. Here's what was happening in my head and in my body at that time. I was under all this stress that made me incapable of understanding what's actually, how I'm coming across. Yeah. And we kind of ended it by her saying, I'm so glad to understand you better because now I know. And we basically said, I said, look, like next time this happens, put it on mute, call me on the phone and say, Moulsari, are you okay?
Yeah.
If I'm being, a bitch, like just ask me if I'm okay, because probably I'm not.
No. Also an interesting observation. So you don't even want to hear, and that's, if you see, and especially if you have children around 15 and 16, if they start behaving badly, it's not because you should be triggered because what's behind it, which uncertainty is triggered if that's going on. Yeah. And then I wonder whether you've had it. I've never reached the top of organization. I've always sort of said, just below the CEOs. But what I've heard from friends who have worked there and also within the organization that I've worked in is that people get shouted at. So people scream. CEOs scream to people. So you have these, serious 40-plus-year-old men around a table, and then someone will go, "You're an idiot for doing this," and you're da-da-da-da. And I asked one of my previous bosses, I said, "So how does that work for you?" So people shout at you, they treat you like a 2-year-old. Right. And then what happens? Well, they don't support each other, so they all go watching at their own, oh my God, hope he's not shouting at me next time. Yeah. These are kind of systematic things. Yeah. And he's probably also shouting because he's under pressure. Yes. And sometimes he's just a plain
and probably someone
asshole.
Shouted at him.
But someone shouted at him.
Of course.
And if you don't understand those kind of systematic patterns that are behind it, I mean, I tended to sort of hate these type of guys. I'm like, oh, mill bullshit, whatever, get out of my way. But, probably that he's also somewhere feeling like a 4-year-old who doesn't know what to do. Yeah. Can we just start conversation when it's about change? We know stuff needs to change. Yeah. We don't know how. Yeah. We don't have the answers.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's also a narrative in that, and I think there's a narrative in like how do you respond to the authority? We spoke a long time.
We spoke about that.
Authority.
And I also would like to react to what you were saying, because you basically presented the solution for what was going on in a situation which you described. Right. Is that when you have the uncomfortable conversation and you create a culture where human connection is possible, and when it's shut down, disconnection starts to happen. People literally are disconnecting from that conversation. And to break that cycle, to break that system of this behavior, this culture within the company, is actually to go through that pain and to not.
Yeah, but there's the thing, and because we also discussed beforehand the narrative and the sort of how power acts, etc. Yes. But what I hear in this story is that actually we are not used to asking power if they're okay. We're not used to asking our mothers, fathers, leaders, and there's nobody who gets up in that audience when explained, my mother just passed away. Yeah. Are you all right? There's no response to that leader that's shouting away and like, do it now, get it done, and that indeed the reflex is like, oh, I'm being told off.
But this is also where female leadership has an opportunity, not because, only females should lead, or there's but basically there's an imbalance. It's not that we should go from one extreme to the other. There's an imbalance. We need more examples and role models of how to demonstrate leadership in a more feminine way. And, well, let's take, Jacinda Ardern, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, her expressions of compassion are feminine. They're not necessarily about being a woman. They're just about being human and compassionate and open and just real. Yeah. And I think that that's part of it, right? So much of tradition and culture that we're coming from, and I really feel that, so I've lived in multiple cultures growing up, but somehow I ended up here, and I really noticed that I question why I ended up in a culture that is so bent upon keeping things in, of not showing what's really going on, where I actually come from, a similar family tradition, but what I'm longing for is to just let it out, be real, connect. And it's not letting it out in an explosion, it's letting it out in a stream, and I love what you just said about connection. Exactly, the moment there's a disconnection, it starts building up. And it builds up and builds up and builds up. And then at some point, there's going to be an explosion because energy has to go somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's a negotiation, right? Yeah. Of where do you find other people to connect, especially in the world? And I just want to get back to that piece of millennial and authority and about self, the focus on the youngsters. That do yourself, be yourself, you know, show yourself. But in that whole self-creation, there's so much more pressure. And I wonder, how does that work? Like they're actually placing themselves as the new authority, but aren't they also enhancing the outer side, the others, as an authority?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question.
It is, yeah.
And I think it's a lot about the interpretation of power, what it means. I think we are brought up with the idea that power is about power over, having power over somebody, over something, not power with, or even at a certain point, power to give it away. And I think that tradition, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, is actually showing that how you can be successful by sharing power.
Yeah.
Instead of the very dominant, on top of each other, power over example which you described. Yeah.
I think that a lot also can be helped with asking power, how power is doing to humanize power. I think that something there is still something that we could explore, because you know, if you're not asking power, how are you actually doing? You know, why are you in this role of authority? Are you, is that fear? Is it all fear? Is it kind of, because generally, especially because you were saying earlier, from a physiological point of view, it's like fight or flight. You know, power or authority is like, it's also a means of gaining control. It means actually that you're in your most vulnerable space. Ladies, time's up already. I'm so sorry. Yes, I know. It's like,
Yes, I know.
Like we're just getting started.
Exactly. We could exactly continue this conversation.
Part 2 and 3
I look
and 4.
forward to doing another session. Thank you all for watching. With these three ladies, we will continue in the highlights. So yeah, stay with us. Thank you.